Welcome to this Prepare for IELTS video in which we're going through 10 top tips to help you in IELTS Writing Task 2. We hope these help. First top tip is a strategy in advance. So before taking the test, prepare a strategy. Some candidates go into the exam, look at the question, and then decide how they are going to tackle it. That is wasted time. You can do that before the exam. So maybe you decide to give yourself a 5-minute plan. Lots of people recommend that because it can mean you come up with better language and better structures. Maybe you're just going to have a quick plan in your head. Maybe you're going to write down a list of arguments that you plan to use, or maybe a list of subject-specific vocabulary you want to include in your answer. Maybe you're going to use a list of complex grammar phrases and you write those down at the beginning of the exam. Maybe you do nothing. These are all options. The point isn't that you should do one of these instead of the other. The point is that you should decide what you're going to do before the exam. How are you going to decide that? Well, practice. Practice all of these strategies before the exam and find out what works best for you. Tip number 2, the pen is mightier than the sword. We understand this refers specifically to the paper-based exam, but we do have a computer-based tip as well. So before you take the exam, work out your average number of words per line or per page, so you don't need to spend time working out how many words you've written in the exam. Of course, in the computer version, this isn't a problem. If you're using paper and pen, practice handwriting for an hour. It's harder than you think. It will probably hurt your wrist and your handwriting will deteriorate. Practice making your handwriting as legible as possible. Legible means easy for other people to read. That can really help your grade. Practice making capital letters and full stops very clear. Examiners sometimes struggle with those. Practice leaving a couple of lines between each paragraph. We'll come back to that at the end of this video. And practice using a pen or pencil similar to the one that you will use in the exam. This is really important. Most people don't write for an hour now, so you need to make sure that you can. You need to develop the muscles. And if you are doing the computer-based version, which many candidates are these days, then do the same. Spend an hour writing on a computer just to let yourself feel how it is. Again, you may find that you don't do this regularly and it's a skill you need to develop. You may find that you become less accurate with your typing as time goes on. So you need to be a good typist if you're doing the computer-based version. Tip 3 is do what you are told to do. And this sounds sensible, but a surprising number of candidates don't. So read the question very carefully and make sure you understand the specific question. Don't just look at the topic and start writing, but look where the question marks are. What are they asking you to do? Is it asking for your opinion? Does it want a position? If it does, you better make sure that you include a position, probably in the introduction, maybe in the conclusion. Is it asking you to describe advantages and disadvantages? Is it asking you to analyze problems and solutions? These are all possibilities. Is it asking you to explain a situation? So make sure you're very clear, not just about the topic, but about the actual question so that you can focus your answer onto what the examiner is looking for. Another important point is to work out if the question is asking you for one thing or two things. So just count the number of question marks. This will probably help. If there are 2, then make sure you're very clear about those 2 things. This might be a problem and solution questions. It might be an explanation and opinion question. But also be careful, because sometimes the 2 questions are put together and there's only 1 question mark. So read very carefully to make sure you know what the examiner is asking for. And generate relevant arguments. So these are often economic, social, psychological, environmental, health, or ethical. You don't just need arguments, you need relevant arguments. Arguments which make sense. Arguments which directly address the question that you're being asked. Tip 4 is be logical, and your essay needs to be complete and consistent. So put a thesis or plan in your introduction. If the question asks for your opinion, then it's generally a good idea to include that at the end of the introduction in your thesis statement. Otherwise, you might indicate in your introduction what your plan is. How are you going to answer this question? Make sure all of your arguments support your thesis or are related to the question, and make sure all your explanations and examples support your arguments. So it's very important that you have relevant arguments and that you have relevant support for these arguments. Make sure that the introduction, main body, and conclusion all follow the same thesis, plan, or idea so that your essay is consistent all the way through. Tip 5, and this is for perfect paragraphs. Make sure each paragraph in the main body is complete. So what does that look like? Decide if your main paragraphs are one idea or list paragraphs. You can look at our video on paragraphs to understand that a little bit better. But if it's a one idea paragraph, then you'll have a topic sentence which is supported. And if it's a list paragraph, you'll have a main topic in the topic sentence and then examples or things which support that. So there's a little bit of a difference, but essentially the same idea. One sentence at the beginning with a main idea, everything else supporting. Include signposts or linking phrases. They can really help connect one paragraph to the previous one or to your thesis. Include topic sentences with one main point and 2 to 4 sentences generally supporting the argument, maybe by explaining it or by giving examples. And there are several ways you can support an argument, and we have a nice video on paragraphs which you should have a look at. Tip 6, repetition can be very annoying, so try really hard not to say the same thing twice. So don't copy more than a couple of words from the question. That's a really bad idea. Try to avoid repeating the same words, especially verbs and nouns. Be very careful to avoid repeating language in the conclusion. So in the conclusion, you will maybe refer back to earlier ideas. That's okay, but try to express them in different words. And these are some of the words that candidates often repeat. Words like people and problem, very, good, bad, think. These are quite basic words, so try to avoid them when you can. Tip 7, complex words and phrases. So IELTS examiners love complex language, or they love complex language when it's used correctly. So it's good to consider the +3 -1 rule. If you're thinking of using some complex language and you're not 100% sure if it's correct, then we would advise you to be a risk taker, because if you get it right, you won't exactly get 3 points, but you will get kind of credit worth 3 points. If you get it wrong, you will lose a little bit, but not as much as you could gain. So we strongly encourage you to be a risk taker. If you think it's right, then use it. If it is, that's great. Even if it's wrong, you might get some credit for being close. And we need to consider the 6 ceiling. And that really is that unless you're using complex language, you are unlikely to get a grade higher than 6, particularly in grammar and vocabulary, lexical resource. So you've really got to take chances and try to use some more complex language if you want to push past that 6 ceiling. Basic language is not a big problem. It's a massive dilemma or a major issue, a huge concern or a troubling matter. So you can see here, try to avoid phrases like big problem and use some of the more complex alternatives. Know lots of words for people, because if you keep repeating people or individuals, the examiner will not be able to give you a very high grade. Moving on to point 8, and this is complex grammar. So a similar idea. The examiners love complex grammar when it's accurate. And the 6 ceiling works here too. So if you use just basic grammar, even if it's very accurate, you're not really going to get a grade higher than 6. Try to include sentences with 2 clauses, so these will either be compound or complex. You will get a lot of credit for this. Not every sentence should be compound or complex, but some certainly should. Try to use a range of more complex verb forms like present perfect continuous, past perfect, future forms, conditionals, as well as modals and passives. But don't try to crowbar them in, so don't just put in a passive because you haven't used one yet. Only use them when they're appropriate. And learn some stems, so phrases like "it has always been thought that" uses a perfect tense. "Since time immemorial, humans have sought to," again, a perfect tense. "If governments had more money," this is conditional. "Before the internet, most of us had never been able to," that's a past perfect. And in the past, individuals used to, obviously using used to. So you can actually prepare some of these phrases and get some of these more complex grammatical structures into your answer. Point 9, learn some phrases. Well, there are other types of phrases that you can use in many essays. And again, phrases like "I wholeheartedly believe that," "I am utterly convinced that," "many experts in the field suggest that," "I fervently hope that," "it is worth pointing out that," "in addition, it should be noted that," and "having considered the arguments in some detail, I have reached the conclusion that." These are all phrases followed by that clauses, and that clauses are your friend. Try to use phrases which allow you to bring them in. Suddenly your writing will be much more complex and impressive. And then number 10, when you're running out of time, write at the end of the exam how to spend the last 5 minutes. And firstly, always write a conclusion. At least that way the examiner will think you finished even if you didn't. Check verbs if you can, and try to add something complex in the gaps at the end of paragraphs. You remember we referred earlier to leaving little gaps at the end of the paragraphs. Well, now is your chance. If you have a couple of spare minutes, you probably don't, but if you find a couple of spare minutes, then you might add another sentence explaining or supporting that argument, maybe using some complex grammar, maybe just giving yourself a slightly better grade. We hope you found that useful and that some of those tips will help you get a slightly higher grade. We look forward to seeing you again soon, and thank you for watching.